The first snow had arrived quietly, the way cherished memories sometimes return, expectedly, yet warmly familiar. It coated the little town of Willow Ridge in a soft, unbroken blanket, turning rooftops into sugared confections and winding streets into white ribbons that glistened under the pale morning sun. In the heart of this postcard-perfect village stood the old clock tower, its hands moving just a fraction slower in the cold, as if savoring every second of December. For years, Evelyn Hart had avoided this place, the narrow streets, the Christmas lights draped from eaves like strands of gold. The smell of cinnamon drifting from the bakery's detail belonged to a chapter of her life she'd closed long ago. But now, after nearly a decade away, she found herself stepping off the bus at the corner of Main and Holly, suitcase in hand. Heart heavy, yet curious. There was something about the first breath of Willow Ridge air in winter. It tasted of pine, wood smoke, and nostalgia, the kind that pressed against the chest until one's heart ached. As Evelyn walked toward the house she once called home, the snow crunched beneath her boots with a rhythm that seemed to match her hesitant steps. Every storefront she passed felt like a time capsule. Mrs. Larkin's bookshop with its steaming window panes, the tiny post office still guarded by a weathered red mailbox, the old ice cream parlor that now offered hot chocolate piled high with marshmallows. She hadn't returned for the magic of the season, at least. That's what she told herself. No, she was here for something far less whimsical, to settle her late father's affairs. His passing had been sudden, a quiet exit in the middle of a quiet night. It left Evelyn with a house full of memories and an ache she wasn't ready to name. The home stood at the edge of town, where the forest began. The porch was dusted with snow, and the wreath, faded, yet still intact, hung exactly where her father had placed it last December. It's the moment she pushed open the door, the scent of cedar and old books wrapped around her like a long-forgotten embrace. She could almost hear his slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, the faint hum of the radio he never turned off during the holidays. Unpacking seemed impossible that first night. Instead, Evelyn sat by the old brick fireplace, letting the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. She traced the outlines of the room with her gaze, the worn armchair her father claimed as his own, the coffee table with its ring stains from countless winter mugs, the stack of photo albums leaning precariously in the corner. The silence here was unlike the cities. It was fuller, deeper, carrying the weight of years. Somewhere outside, bells jingled as a sleigh passed down the snowy lane, the sound fading into the stillness. Evelyn thought about how life had shifted since she'd last heard such a sound. Back then, her days had been filled with warm laughter, bustling kitchens, and the warmth of belonging. Now, she was unsure if she could ever feel that again. The snow outside thickened, blurring the edges of the world. And as the fire burned low, Evelyn realized that coming home wasn't simply about sorting through boxes or signing papers. It was about standing in the very place where life had once felt whole and deciding if she was ready to believe in that feeling again. Asterisk. Morning arrived in Willow Ridge as if the world had been dipped in gold. The sun rose behind a veil of soft clouds, turning the snowy rooftops into a sea of shimmering light. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, mingling with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on Main Street. Evelyn stepped outside, the air crisp, enough to bite, yet gentle enough to welcome her. The snow beneath her boots whispered its soft, powdery crunch. Each step a reminder of where she was and what she had left behind. Down the lane, the town seemed to pulse with a quiet joy, the kind that came not from grand celebrations, but from small, spoken rituals repeated every December. Main Street was already stirring. The lampposts were wrapped in evergreen garlands, their tips frosted white. Every shop window seemed to tell its own little story, hand-knit scarves draped over vintage armchairs, trays of gingerbread men smiling beneath glass domes, tiny ceramic houses glowing from within as though they, too, had caught the Christmas spirit. She wandered past the cafe she used to visit after school, its chalkboard menu now framed with twinkling lights. Through the glass, she saw townsfolk she vaguely remembered, faces older, hair grayer, but with the same familiar ease in their posture. They were gathered in groups, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs, their heads tilted toward one another in that quiet, attentive way people have when listening to a story worth savoring. At the far end of the street stood the willow ridge tree, a towering spruce that seemed to touch the clouds. Volunteers moved about its base, wrapping thick strands of lights around its branches, the bulbs flashing briefly as they tested each section. Children darted between the grown-ups, their mittened hands clutching snowballs they were not supposed to throw, though the occasional burst of laughter suggested otherwise. Evelyn paused, taking it all in. There was something both foreign and achingly familiar about this scene. It was as though she had stepped into a painting she had once known well, only to find that the brushstrokes had shifted in her absence. She lingered near the square, watching, as the mayor, a stocky man with a wool scarf that looked older than the town itself, supervised the decorating. His gestures were broad, his voice warm enough to carry over the snow. He directed people with a kind of authority that came not from power, but from years of simply belonging here. The church bells rang at the top of the hour, the sound rolling over rooftops and disappearing into the forest. Somewhere deep inside her, Evelyn felt the faintest tug, a reminder of carols sung in pews long ago, of candlelight flickering against stained glass, of her father's quiet voice humming along. Her steps eventually led her to the frozen pond on the edge of town. Its surface was a perfect mirror for the gray sky above, marred only by the lines carved by skates the day before. A young couple glided across it now, their movements in sync, as though they were tracing a memory only they shared. She watched them for a while, not with envy, but with the quiet yearning she could not yet name. By the time she made her way back to the house, the lights in town had begun to glow against the dimming afternoon. One by one, windows lit up, spilling warm rectangles of gold onto the snow. The air filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts and pine. And somewhere, a fiddle played a tune that drifted through the streets like a ribbon. That night, Evelyn lit the fireplace again. She sat with a blanket draped over her shoulders, listening to the wind brush against the windows. The fire's warmth seeped into her bones, but it was the memory of the town's a tree, the skaters, the shop windows that stayed with her. It felt almost as though the place itself had reached out to her, wrapping her in something she hadn't realized she'd missed. The question lingered in her mind as she closed her eyes. Was it possible that a town, much like a person, could still hold a place for you after all these years? Asterisk, asterisk, the days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that wrapped itself around a person without them noticing. Mornings in Willow Ridge began with the scent of snow and the muted chatter of neighbors greeting each other across driveways. Afternoons brought the low hum of preparation, the baker arranging pies in neat rows, the florist tying ribbons around wreaths, the sound of ladders creaking under the weight of people stringing lights higher and higher. Evelyn kept mostly to herself, tending to the slow work of sorting through her father's belongings. Each drawer was a small time capsule, receipts for hardware from decades ago, postcards from towns she had never visited, neatly folded scarves still carrying the faint scent of pine cologne. Every item seemed to hum with a quiet significance, as though it had been waiting for her return. One cold afternoon, a knock echoed through the old wooden door. By the time she reached it, there was no one standing on the porch, only a small wicker basket resting atop the snow-dusted welcome mat. Inside were neatly wrapped cookies, tied with a ribbon the color of deep cranberry, and a folded card with her name written in careful, looping handwriting. The message inside was brief, but warm in its simplicity. We'd love to see you at the winter gathering. Friday at 7, Town Square. The winter gathering. She remembered it well, an evening where the entire town came together under the towering spruce tree. Tables lined with baked goods and spiced cider, lanterns swaying gently in the cold night air, and a soft murmur of carols drifting between the clusters of neighbors. It had been a tradition for as long as she could remember, the kind of event where no one needed an official invitation because it was simply understood. You came, you stayed, you belonged. Yet, for Evelyn, the idea of going stirred something complicated. The thought of weaving through familiar faces, of being recognized and remembered, felt like opening a door she wasn't sure she could step through. But as the days edged closer to Friday, the basket of cookies on her kitchen counter became more than a gesture, became a quiet pull. On the evening of the gathering, the town transformed. The square glowed under the embrace of hundreds of twinkling lights. Its great spruce stood tall and proud, its branches heavy with ornaments that sparkled like frozen raindrops. Its lanterns were strung between buildings, casting a golden haze that made the snow shimmer as though it were sprinkled with tiny stars. People moved between tables, laden with pies, jars of jam, loaves of bread still warm from the oven. The air was alive with mingled scents: cider, roasted chestnuts, cinnamon, and wood smoke. Somewhere, a quartet played softly, their instruments weaving together a sound both festive and intimate. Evelyn lingered at the edge of the crowd at first, letting the tide of voices and laughter wash over her. Faces passed, some strangers, some faintly familiar, their features softened by years, yet brightened by recognition. A few nodded, offering the kind of smile that didn't demand explanation. She found herself drawn toward the spruce tree, where children darted between the adults, their scarves trailing behind like colorful comets. The mayor stood nearby, greeting each person with the same measured warmth. His wool scarf once again wound tightly against the cold. And then she noticed him standing just a little apart from the rest, his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark coat, his gaze resting quietly on the tree's lights. Something about the way he stood, the stillness in his posture, tugged at a memory buried deep within her. But before she could follow the thread of recognition, he turned and melted into the crowd. When the evening wound down, Evelyn walked home. Slowly, cold air carried the lingering echoes of the gathering laughter music, the low hum of voices carried off by the wind. In her pocket, she carried a small ornament she had been handed at one of the tables, a smooth wooden star with a red ribbon looped through it. She placed it on the mantel that night, the fire's glow reflecting softly against its polished surface. And though she couldn't quite say why, she felt as though something in the town had quietly shifted, like a door had opened, just a crack, waiting for her to step through. Asterisk snow returned the next morning, falling in fine deliberate flakes that seemed in no hurry to reach the ground. The town looked softer beneath it, as though the edges of every building and tree had been brushed with a gentle hand. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, watching the snowfall blur the forest beyond the house. The wooden star still sat on the mantel, catching the morning light, its red ribbon curling slightly from the fire's warmth the night before. Her mind kept drifting back to the man she had seen near the spruce tree during the winter gathering. There had been nothing extraordinary in his appearance, no grand gesture, no flash of recognition, but there had been something in the stillness of him, a quiet, unspoken weight, the kind of presence that draws the eye without demanding it. She hadn't thought she would see him again so soon, but later that afternoon, while walking to the post office to send a letter, she spotted him across the street. He was carrying a box tucked under one arm, his boots leaving crisp impressions in the snow. The brim of his knit cap shadowed his face, but There was a carefulness to the way he moved, as though each step was measured against the memory of a different time. He passed by without noticing her. Yet something in the air shifted as he did, a faint stirring, like the way the world feels just before the first note of a song begins. Evelyn couldn't name the feeling, nor did she try. She simply watched until he disappeared into the bakery. The days that followed unfolded in small, steady moments. She saw him again at the general store, carrying a paper bag filled with something that steamed faintly in the cold. Once, she caught sight of him on the frozen pond, helping a young boy lace up a pair of skates. The boy's laughter carried across the ice, but the man's expression remained gentle and subdued, as though joy for him was something quiet, something kept close. Evelyn found herself wondering about him, who he was, whether he had always lived here, whether he too was returning after years away. It wasn't curiosity in the usual sense. It was more like the way one wonders about a line in a song that lingers long after it's finished playing. One afternoon, she decided to walk through the town square again. The spruce tree still stood in its winter glory, but now snow had gathered thick along its lower branches. The decorations from the gathering remained, swaying slightly in the wind, their colors softened by the frost. And there, near the base of the tree, she noticed a small wooden bench she hadn't remembered before. It was unremarkable, except for one detail, a tiny carving along the edge of the seat. At first glance, it was nothing more than a simple design of pine branches. But on closer look, she saw initials carved just below them. The letters were worn smooth, as though touched often over the years. She didn't know whose they were, but the bench felt like the sort of place where stories had been told, where someone had sat through countless winters, watching the world turn white again and again. As she lingered there, the sound of footsteps on snow made her turn. The man was crossing the square, his coat buttoned against the wind, a paper bag in one hand. He didn't notice her at first, but when his gaze did catch hers, he paused just for a moment. It wasn't a look of surprise, nor was it exactly recognition. It was something quieter, like two threads brushing against each other without yet knotting together. Then he nodded, a simple acknowledgement, and continued on his way. That evening, Evelyn sat by the fire with a book open in her lap, though she hardly read a word. The day's images kept replaying the falling snow, the initials on the bench, the man's steady gaze. None of it was enough to tell her who he was, but perhaps that wasn't the point. Sometimes, she thought, it's not the whole story that draws us in. It's the first page. Asterisk, asterisk. The bench by the spruce tree seemed to take root in Evelyn's thoughts. It wasn't grand or new, but it had the kind of presence that grew heavier the more she thought about it. She began to notice how it stood in the perfect place to watch the whole square of the tree. The shops, the way the street curved gently toward the frozen pond. It was a vantage point for witnessing the life of the town, quietly, without being seen too much yourself. The next morning brought another light snowfall, each flake drifting lazily, as though the world had slowed its breath. Evelyn bundled herself in her father's old wool coat and set out with no particular destination. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few shopkeepers sweeping snow from their steps and the muffled sound of a radio playing a Christmas hymn somewhere in the distance. When she reached the square, the bench was dusted with a fine layer of snow. She brushed it off with her gloved hand and sat down. The wood was cold beneath her, the air crisp and clean. From here, she could see the bakery's warm windows glowing, the post office door swinging open as someone stepped out, the tall spruce rising like a guardian over it all. For a long while, she simply sat. People came and went, an elderly woman with a basket tucked into the crook of her arm, a young boy dragging a sled behind him, a man carrying packages wrapped in brown paper. Every face seemed to carry its own quiet story, every movement its own rhythm in the song of the season. She wondered if the man she'd seen would pass through today. So it's not expectation, exactly, but a kind of gentle readiness. And then, almost as though the thought had conjured him, she saw him at the far end of the square. He walked at an unhurried pace, a scarf wound loosely at his neck, a thermos in his hand. When he reached the bench, he slowed, as if deciding whether to stop. For a brief moment, his gaze rested on the empty space beside her. Then, with a small nod that seemed both greeting and permission, he took a seat at the far end. No words were exchanged, but the silence between them felt companionable rather than strained. They watched the town move together, two quiet observers sharing the same view. The thermos in his hands sent faint tendrils of steam into the cold air, and Evelyn could just catch the scent of something spiced, perhaps cinnamon, perhaps clove. After a time, he stood, adjusted his scarf, and walked on, leaving nothing behind but a faint impression in the snow where his boots had rested. Yet, when Evelyn rose from the bench and turned to leave, she noticed something tucked into the far corner of the seat. A small wooden carving of a pine branch, no larger than her palm. Its edges smoothed by careful hands. She slipped it into her coat pocket, feeling the weight of it against her. It was a small thing, yet it carried the same quiet pull as the wooden star now resting on her mantle. She didn't know if it was his doing or simply a relic left behind by another winter, but it felt meant for her in some unspoken way. That night, the firelight danced across both the star and the pine carving, their shadows long against the wall. Evelyn realized she was no longer just passing through the days in Willow Ridge. The town was beginning to speak to her, not in grand gestures, but in small, almost hidden offerings. And she was beginning to listen. The storm arrived without fanfare. One evening, the clouds gathered low and heavy over Willow Ridge, pressing the sky closer to the rooftops. By nightfall, the first flakes had begun to fall, small, fast, urgent. By morning, the world beyond Evelyn's window was a blur of white. The wind moved through the trees like a restless breath, sending snow spiraling in every direction. It clung to windowsills, buried fences, and softened the sharp edges of every rooftop. The street outside was almost unrecognizable. Even the familiar path to the square had vanished beneath a deep, unbroken layer of snow. Inside the house, the fire crackled with a steady confidence, its warmth reaching even into the far corners of the room. Evelyn wrapped herself in a thick blanket and sipped slowly from a mug of tea, watching the storm claim the day. There was a certain peace to it, the way the world seemed to pause when the snow came heavy like this, a pause that asked nothing of her but stillness. But as the hours passed, she began to feel the familiar pull of the outside world, that quiet curiosity about how the town moved when wrapped in such weather. Pulling on her boots and her father's old coat, she stepped out into the swirl of snow. The cold bit instantly at her cheeks, but the air felt alive, sharp, clean, almost electric. The streets were nearly deserted. A few brave souls moved slowly through the drifts, their figures blurred by the wind. The lampposts glowed faintly in the dim light, their halos blurred by falling snow. Every sound was softened, every movement muted, as though the storm had placed the whole town under glass at the square. The great spruce swayed gently, its branches bending under the weight of snow. And there, just as if the storm itself had spared him from its chaos, sat the man on the same bench, his dark coat dusted white, his scarf pulled close to his face. Evelyn hesitated, the wind pressing at her back before crossing the square. When she reached the bench, he shifted slightly, making room without a word. She sat, the cold of the wood seeping through her coat, and together they faced the storm. Snowflakes clung to the edges of his knit cap, melting slowly into his hair. His breath rose in small, visible clouds. Every so often, he would glance toward the spruce, as though measuring its resilience against the weight it bore. Evelyn found herself doing the same, the two of them watching the tree stand unshaken in the wind's push. After a while, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew something smaller, folded scrap of paper, its edges worn. A key. Set it on the bench between them and, without looking at her, stood and walked away into the storm. His figure blurred almost instantly, swallowed by the falling snow. Evelyn sat for a moment before picking up the paper. Inside was a simple sketch of the square of the spruce, the bakery, the bench. But there, on the bench in the drawing, were two small figures, side by side, drawn with careful, deliberate lines. When she returned home, she placed the sketch beside the wooden star and the pine carving. 3 objects now, each different, yet each tied together by the same quiet thread. The storm outside howled into the night, but the firelight in her home seemed warmer, steadier than it had in years. Asterisk, the storm passed as quietly as it had come, leaving Willow Ridge blanketed in a pure, untouched whiteness. For 2 days, the air was still, the snow undisturbed, save for the narrow paths cleared by determined hands. The spruce stood taller than ever, its branches now sparkling with frost in the pale winter sunlight. It was during this calm that the town began preparing for the Festival of Candles and Night that came but once each December, when the streets would glow with hundreds of flickering flames, and the entire village would walk together in a slow procession through the snow. Evelyn remembered it from her childhood, though the memory was soft around the edges, more a feeling than a clear image, warm light against dark skies. The muffled sound of footsteps, the strange hush that fell over everyone, as though the night itself was sacred. By late afternoon, the preparations were well underway. Glass jars, each holding a single white candle, were placed along windowsills, on fence posts, and in neat rows down the main street. The smell of beeswax and pine drifted on the cold air. Bundled figures moved quietly from place to place, shielding the candles from the wind as they lit them one by one. Evelyn joined the slow tide of people gathering near the square, her own candle cupped carefully between her gloved hands. The world around her was transforming the snow beneath her boots, reflecting the golden glow. The shadows of the townsfolk stretching long and wavering across the ground. The spruce, lit from within by strings of tiny bulbs, seemed to hold the heart of the night in its branches. And then she saw him. He was standing near the bench, the flame of his candle steady despite the faint breeze. His coat was dark against the snow, his scarf the same soft gray she had seen before. The light from the candle caught in his eyes, making them seem deeper, warmer, as though they held something unspoken yet certain. When she reached him, he didn't speak, didn't gesture, only shifted slightly so she could stand beside him. The bench behind them was half buried in snow, but they faced the same view. The town gathered in a loose circle around the spruce, their candles turning the night into a living constellation. The procession began slowly. One by one, people stepped forward, their candles held high, and walked together along the snow-covered path that wound through the heart of Willow Ridge. Evelyn and the man joined near the middle, their footsteps falling into the same rhythm. Around them, the air was filled with the faint sound of humming, wordless melody that seemed to belong to the town itself. They walked in silence, but the silence was full of the soft crunch of snow, the shared warmth of candlelight, the knowledge that here, in this moment, they were not alone. When the procession ended back at the square, the townsfolk lingered, reluctant to let the night go. Before leaving, the man reached into his coat once more. This time, he handed her a small envelope, its flap sealed with a tiny pressed sprig of pine. Then, without waiting for her to open it, he turned and disappeared into the thinning crowd, his figure once again swallowed by the winter night. Back home, Evelyn broke the seal and drew out a single sheet of paper. Written in a hand both careful and steady was a simple message. Some things are better shown than told. Beneath the words was another small sketch, this time of the bench. But now with 3 objects resting upon it: a star, a pine carving, and a candle. She placed a note beside the other treasures on the mantel. And for the first time in years, she felt the unmistakable warmth of belonging, not just to a place, but perhaps to a story still being written. Asterisk, asterisk, Christmas morning arrived, draped in quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, but fullness of pause between heartbeats, holding everything tenderly in place. The town lay under a fresh layer of snow, smooth as porcelain, unbroken except for the faint paths left by early risers, carrying loaves of bread or delivering wrapped parcels to doorsteps. Evelyn woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains, the hearth cold now, but ready to be rekindled. The 3 objects on the mantel, the wooden star, the pine carving, and the candle sketch, caught the pale glow, their shadows stretching gently across the wall. They looked like pieces of a puzzle whose shape she was only just beginning to see. She dressed slowly, layering warmth against the winter air, and stepped outside. The streets were still, but in the distance, the bells of the church began to ring, a slow, steady chime that seemed to invite the town to gather. Drawn by the sound, she walked toward the square. The spruce stood waiting, its ornaments gleaming under the soft light. The bench, half buried in snow, looked exactly as it had the day she first noticed it. And sitting there, as though the morning had been made for this moment, was the man. He rose as she approached, brushing the snow from the seat beside him. For a moment, they simply stood there, the cold air visible between their breaths, the church bells still echoing faintly in the distance. Then, with a quiet gesture, he reached into his coat pocket one last time. From it, he drew a small, square box, simple and unadorned except for a thin red ribbon. Inside was another carving, this one a circle of wood, smooth and polished, with the outline of the spruce tree etched at its center. But what caught her breath were the details. At the base of the tree sat the bench, and on the bench, 2 figures side by side. She traced the carving with her glove, the texture of the etched lines warm even in the cold air. And in that instant, she understood not every story needed to be told in words. Some stories lived in shared silences, in small gifts, in the steady rhythm of 2 people simply showing up for each other. They sat together as the town began to stir. Families passed through the square, children's laughter rising above the crunch of boots on snow. Someone waved from the bakery window. Another paused to adjust the lights on the spruce. Life moved gently around them, but the bench felt like its own small world. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. The spruce sparkled as though holding 1,000 tiny stars. Evelyn looked at the man beside her and felt no need to fill the space with words. The season had given her back more than memories. It had given her a reason to stay. When they finally rose to leave, the snow around the bench bore the marks of where they'd been 2 sets of footprints, side by side, leading away from the square, winding together down the street, back at the house. The fire crackled once more, and the mantle now held 4 treasures, 4 pieces of a story that began with a star, a bench, and the quiet magic of returning home. That night, as the town settled under the weight of another gentle snowfall, Evelyn felt the truth settle into her heart like a promise. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not loud or sudden. Sometimes, they are simply the chance to begin again, quietly, with someone who knows how to listen. And so, Willow Ridge kept its lights glowing through the long winter night, as if to hold this truth, safe for anyone who might come searching.